My daughter came to me in tears, begging me to sign some routine city permits so her expensive backyard renovation would not be shut down by the city. I am a father. I loved her. I trusted her. So I signed the bottom line without reading the dense header. Exactly 1 week later, a stranger knocked on my door and handed me a thick manila envelope. It was a civil lawsuit from a commercial bank. $300,000. And right there at the bottom of the guarantor agreement was my signature. Before I tell you how a father meticulously dismantles his own daughter to save his own life, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe betrayal from your own blood is the worst kind of poison. Now let me take you back to the exact moment my quiet retirement was burned to the ground. The morning it happened started like any other Tuesday. I am 68 years old, and I live alone in a modest 3-bedroom house I paid off a decade ago. I thrive on routine. At 7 in the morning, I was standing in my kitchen pouring hot water over my coffee grounds, watching the steam rise against the morning light. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, aggressive sound that felt completely out of place in my quiet neighborhood. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door. A man in a cheap gray suit was standing on my porch, holding a clipboard and a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Gordon. I nodded, and he shoved the envelope against my chest. He told me I had been served and walked rapidly back to his sedan without another word. I stood on the porch, feeling the sudden heavy weight of the paper in my hands. I went back inside, sitting at my kitchen island. I tore the envelope open. The first page was a court summons. The plaintiff was Apex Commercial Lending. The defendant was me. My eyes scanned down the page, trying to make sense of the aggressive legal jargon. Then I saw the number. $300,000 for a defaulted commercial equipment loan. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I turned to the second page, which was a photocopy of the loan agreement. I did not recognize the account numbers. I did not recognize the corporate entity listed as the primary borrower. But then I reached the final page. There, at the bottom of a personal guarantor clause, was my signature. It was not forged. It was my exact handwriting. I traced the blue ink with my finger, feeling a sudden wave of nausea. Right next to my signature was a date. The date was exactly 1 week ago. The memory of last Tuesday hit me like a physical blow. The rain had been pouring outside when my front door flew open. Natalie, my 34-year-old daughter, had barged into my house without knocking. She was frantic, holding a stack of papers attached to a heavy wooden clipboard. Natalie always lived beyond her means. She and her husband Trevor owned a massive house in a gated community completely funded by Trevor, running a mid-sized logistics company. Lately, Natalie had been obsessing over a $50,000 backyard renovation. That rainy Tuesday, she had stood in my living room smelling of expensive perfume and panic. She told me the city zoning board was threatening to shut down the construction because of a property line dispute. She was crying, real tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She said the contractors were going to walk off the job and keep her deposit if she did not get a signature from the original guarantor of her mortgage. Years ago, I had co-signed her first starter home, and she claimed the city still had me on file as a financial backer. She shoved the clipboard at me. The top pages were folded back, exposing only the bottom signature line. I had reached for my reading glasses, but she grabbed my wrist. She told me the city clerk was closing in 10 minutes, and if she did not email a photo of the signature immediately, her backyard would be a dirt pit for 6 months. When I hesitated, she played the ultimate card. She told me I never supported her choices and that I was always looking for a reason to see her fail. The guilt worked. It always worked. I took her silver pen and signed the bottom line. She kissed my cheek, snatched the clipboard, and ran out the door. The entire interaction had lasted less than 3 minutes. Sitting in my kitchen, staring at the lawsuit, I realized she had never been to the city zoning board. I reached for my cell phone, my hands trembling slightly with a mixture of shock and a slowly building rage. I dialed the toll-free number listed at the top of the lawsuit. After 10 minutes of terrible hold music, a woman from the Asset Recovery Department of Apex Commercial Lending answered the phone. I gave her the case number printed on my summons. I told her there had to be a mistake. I explained that I was retired, that I had never taken out a commercial loan in my life, and that I believed my signature had been attached to the wrong document by accident. The woman on the phone did not sound sympathetic. She sounded like someone who dealt with desperate liars every single day. She pulled up the file and her tone became sharp and bureaucratic. She informed me that there was no mistake. The primary borrower on the account was Trevor. Her words stopped my heart. Trevor, my son-in-law. She explained that Trevor had taken out a $300,000 loan for heavy machinery for his logistics company. He had missed his last 3 payments. The bank had initiated the process to freeze his corporate accounts and seize his personal assets. Trevor was 24 hours away from total financial ruin. But then the woman explained a miracle occurred for Trevor. Last Tuesday, he submitted a revised contract with a new personal guarantor, a guarantor who owned his home outright and had excellent credit. The asset seizure against Trevor was instantly halted because the liability was legally transferred to me. The woman on the phone asked if I had any further questions. I did not. I hung up the phone. The trap was perfectly designed. Trevor was drowning, so he and Natalie had thrown me an anvil to keep themselves afloat. They knew I would never willingly risk my home to cover his business failures. So they wrapped his commercial debt in a fake story about city permits and manipulated me into signing away my life. The silence in my kitchen was deafening. The coffee in my mug had gone completely cold. Most men my age would have panicked. Most men would have called their daughter demanding an explanation, begging for it to be a misunderstanding. But I did not feel panic. The initial shock had burned away, leaving nothing but absolute cold clarity. I looked around my house. I had built the back deck with my own hands. I had paid off the mortgage by working 60-hour weeks for 35 years. This house was my sanctuary, my safety net, and my legacy. And my own daughter had casually handed it over to a bank to protect her husband's ego and her own luxurious lifestyle. I gathered the lawsuit papers and slid them carefully back into the manila envelope. I walked to the hallway closet and put on my heavy winter coat. I picked up my car keys from the bowl by the door. I did not call Natalie to warn her I was coming. I stepped out into the crisp morning air, locked my front door, and got into my car. The drive across town took 45 minutes. I watched the scenery change from my working-class neighborhood with its modest lawns and older cars to the sprawling, manicured estates of her gated community. I pulled up to their massive driveway. Trevor's luxury SUV was parked near the garage, gleaming in the sun. It was a vehicle bought with money he did not actually have, protected by a debt he had fraudulently forced upon my shoulders. I turned off the engine. I picked up the manila envelope from the passenger seat. I walked up the stone pathway to their custom oak front door. I did not ring the doorbell. I simply turned the handle, knowing they never locked it during the day, and stepped inside, ready to confront the people who had just sold my future. I stepped into the grand foyer of my daughter house. The air inside smelled of expensive vanilla candles and fresh orchids. The floors were imported Italian marble. It was a stark contrast to the worn hardwood of my own living room. Every piece of furniture and every piece of art on the walls screamed of a success that I now knew was entirely fabricated. I walked down the wide hallway toward the sound of casual conversation and the clinking of silverware. They were in the kitchen. I paused in the archway. The kitchen was massive. It was anchored by a gleaming white quartz island. Natalie was leaning against the counter, sipping a green smoothie from a tall glass. Her hair was perfectly styled for a Tuesday morning. Trevor sat on one of the velvet bar stools. He was wearing a designer silk robe and scrolling idly through his phone. He looked completely relaxed. This was the man who, according to the bank, was 24 hours away from absolute financial ruin just a week ago. Now he looked like a man without a single care in the world. He looked like a man who had successfully passed his execution sentence onto someone else. I walked forward. My heavy boots made a dull thud against the marble announcing my presence. Natalie looked up. She did not smile. She let out a small, irritated sigh as if the local handyman had arrived unannounced to fix a leaky pipe. I did not say a word of greeting. I walked straight to the quartz island. I pulled the thick manila envelope from my coat pocket and dropped it flat on the counter. The heavy slap of the paper against the stone echoed in the large room. Trevor barely glanced up from his phone. He took a sip of his espresso and asked what the delivery was. He sounded bored. I kept my eyes locked on my daughter. I told her it was a lawsuit from Apex Commercial Lending. I told her they were demanding $300,000. I waited for the panic. I waited for the tears and the apologies. I waited for the frantic explanation that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. I waited for my daughter to act like a daughter who had accidentally destroyed her father. But the panic never came. Natalie slowly set her green smoothie down. She did not look surprised. She looked inconvenienced. She crossed her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater and looked me right in the eye. She told me I was overreacting. She used that exact word. Overreacting. She said it was just standard corporate posturing and that I should not have driven all the way over here just to cause a scene. I felt a coldness spread through my chest. I pointed to the document. I told her I was being sued for a commercial loan default because my signature was on the guarantor line. I reminded her it was the signature she took from me under the guise of a city permit for her backyard. Trevor finally put his phone face down on the counter. He leaned back on his velvet stool and let out a short, arrogant laugh. He told me to calm down. He said the bank was just flexing its muscles and that it would all blow over in a few months. He spoke to me slowly, using the condescending tone one might use with a confused child. He explained that business was just a game of moving liabilities around until the market stabilized. He actually believed he was teaching me a lesson in high-level finance. He looked at me with total apathy. He was completely disconnected from the fact that he had just mortgaged my entire existence to save his own. I turned my focus back to Natalie. I asked her how she could look me in the eye and hand me a fake clipboard. I asked her how she could sleep at night, knowing she had handed my home and my life savings over to a collection agency. This was the moment I expected the guilt to finally break through her carefully crafted facade. Instead, she went on the offensive. Her tone became sharp and incredibly cruel. She stepped closer to the island, leaning over the lawsuit. She told me I was 68 years old. She told me my life was already over. She actually said those words out loud. She explained her logic with a chilling, clinical precision. If Trevor went bankrupt, his business would die. They would lose this house. They would lose their country club memberships and their luxury cars. They would lose their entire social standing. Their lives, she argued, were just beginning. But me? She reasoned that I already owned my small house. I had my social security. If I had to declare personal bankruptcy, it would hardly change my daily routine. I would just have bad credit for a few years. According to her, that did not matter because I was too old to buy anything new anyway. I stood there listening to the daughter I had raised, rationalizing my financial execution as a practical family decision. She genuinely believed that because my life was quiet and modest, it was disposable. She believed it was my duty as a father to act as a human shield for her husband's incompetence. She did not see a crime. She saw a resource reallocation. She looked at me not as a person, but as an outdated asset that could be liquidated to maintain her lifestyle. Trevor chimed in again, agreeing with her. He told me I was being selfish. He said family was supposed to help family during economic downturns. He promised he would buy me a nice steak dinner once his company rebounded next quarter. He offered me a steak dinner in exchange for $300,000 of stolen credit. The sheer audacity of his offer was so profound it almost felt unreal. They were gaslighting me in my own language, twisting their felony into an act of necessary family sacrifice. A younger man might have reached across the quartz island and grabbed Trevor by the throat. A weaker man might have broken down in tears, begging them to call the bank and fix it. But I did neither. The emotional part of my brain simply shut down. The part that loved my daughter and wanted to believe in her goodness flatlined. In its place, the cold, calculating mind of a man who had spent decades dissecting financial crimes woke up. I looked at their marble floors. I looked at Trevor in his silk robe. I looked at Natalie with her arrogant, annoyed face. They were incredibly confident in their victory. They thought because I was old and quiet, I was also stupid. They thought I would just absorb the blow and fade away into poverty. I did not argue. Arguing is what you do when you believe the other person has a conscience that can be reached. You do not argue with parasites. You exterminate them. I reached out and picked up the manila envelope. I tucked it neatly back into my heavy winter coat. I looked at Natalie one last time. I did not see my little girl anymore. I saw a liability. I told them to enjoy their morning. I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen. I heard Trevor laugh as I walked down the hallway. He told Natalie I would cool off by tomorrow. I walked out the front door and stepped into the cold sunlight. The anger was gone. Only the mission remained. I did not make it to my car. My hand was on the heavy brass handle of the front door when I heard the sharp clicking of Natalie walking rapidly down the marble hallway behind me. She called out my name. Not Dad. She used my first name, Gordon. It was a calculated choice designed to strip away the familial bond and establish her absolute authority. I stopped and opened the door, letting the cold morning air hit my face before I turned around. She stepped out onto the massive stone porch, folding her arms across her chest to ward off the chill. I thought for a fleeting second that she had followed me to apologize. I thought the reality of what she had done might have finally pierced her armor of arrogance. I was completely wrong. She had not come out to ask for forgiveness. She had come out to ensure I knew my place. She stood on the top step, looking down at me. Her voice dropped the annoyed tone from the kitchen and took on a cold, measured quality. She told me I needed to stop acting like a victim. She said I had spent my entire life playing it safe, hiding in my modest little house, working a boring government job, and never taking any real risks. She pointed toward Trevor's luxury vehicle parked in the driveway. She said Trevor was a builder. He was a creator who took massive risks to provide her with the life I never could. She actually looked me in the eye and told me that my lack of ambition during her childhood had been a source of constant embarrassment for her. While her friends at the private school I had bankrupted myself to pay for went to Europe for the summer, she had to stay home. She said she had spent 34 years feeling like she was owed something better. I stood on the driveway, listening to the sheer magnitude of her delusion. I remembered the 60-hour work weeks. I remembered wearing shoes with holes in the soles so I could afford her horseback riding lessons. But I said nothing. My silence seemed to fuel her. She stepped down closer to me, her voice rising with a strange, twisted passion. She explained that she did not view the forged signature as a crime. She viewed it as an involuntary family loan. She told me that parents are supposed to be safety nets. She said a good father would gladly sacrifice his own comfort to ensure his daughter did not lose her social standing. She used those exact words. Social standing. She was not worried about starvation or homelessness. She was terrified of her wealthy friends finding out she was a fraud. And to prevent that embarrassment, she was willing to throw me to the wolves. She told me that nature dictates the old must make way for the young. She actually tried to use biology to justify grand larceny. She said a tree drops its dead branches so the new buds can grow. I was the dead branch. She and Trevor were the future. She explained that if they lost their country club membership, Trevor would lose his networking opportunities. If he lost his networking opportunities, his business could never recover. Therefore, taking my house was not theft. It was an investment in the family economic survival. She completely ignored the fact that his business was failing because he was incompetent. She blamed the economy, she blamed his employees, and finally she blamed me for not offering my house to them voluntarily months ago. She said if I had just been generous from the start, she would not have been forced to trick me with the city permit story. She blamed me for making her lie. The psychological gymnastics required to reach that conclusion were staggering. She began to outline her vision for my future with terrifying precision. She told me the bank was going to take my house, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. She advised me not to waste money on a lawyer because the signature was real and any judge would side with the bank. She said she had already researched the bankruptcy process for seniors. She explained that my Social Security checks were protected from garnishment, so I would not starve. She offered this information as if she were doing me a massive favor, as if she had thoughtfully curated my destruction. Then she smiled. It was a tight, thin smile devoid of any warmth. She told me that after the bank evicted me, she and Trevor would graciously allow me to go into the small guest suite above their detached garage. She said I could help out around the property and maybe watch their future children to earn my keep. She was offering me a job as her indentured servant in exchange for stealing my entire net worth. She had it all planned out. She had dismantled my life piece by piece and repackaged it into a convenient solution for her own greed. She truly believed I would just lower my head and accept this fate because I had always yielded to her demands in the past. She thought my quiet nature was proof of my weakness. I watched the way her hands moved as she spoke. She was so calm. Her breathing was steady. Her heart rate was probably completely normal. It takes a terrifying type of person to destroy someone's life and feel absolutely no physical stress response. I realized I had failed her as a parent, not because I did not buy her enough expensive things, but because I had never taught her that actions have consequences. I had protected her from every mistake she had ever made. When she crashed her first car, I paid the deductible. When she dropped out of her first college, I paid the tuition penalty. I had spent a lifetime cushioning her falls, and now she expected me to throw myself under a moving train to save her. As she spoke, I experienced a profound internal shift. It was a physical sensation, like a heavy iron chain snapping inside my chest. For 34 years, I had carried the burden of unconditional love. I had forgiven her tantrums, her selfishness, and her endless demands because she was my child. But looking at her standing on the stone driveway, lecturing me about my duty to fund her vanity, I realized the daughter I loved did not actually exist. She was a phantom I had created in my own mind to justify her terrible behavior. The woman standing in front of me was a predator. She was a parasite who had attached herself to my life and was now preparing to drain the final drops of my blood. The grief I expected to feel never arrived. There was no sadness. There was only a cold, crystalline emptiness. The shift from father to auditor was the most profound experience of my life. It was a pure survival mechanism. If I stayed Gordon the father, I would have collapsed on the pavement and died of a broken heart. So my brain simply deleted him. The auditor took over. The auditor did not care about her cashmere sweater or her green smoothie. The auditor only cared about the numbers. $300,000. A commercial equipment loan. The auditor knew that banks do not hand over that kind of money without collateral inspections and wire transfers. The money had to go somewhere. And the auditor knew with absolute certainty that Trevor was not smart enough to hide $300,000 without leaving a massive, easily traceable paper trail. She finished her speech by telling me to go home and wait for the bank to call. She told me to be a good father for once in my life and take the hit. I looked at her face, memorizing the absolute certainty in her eyes. I wanted to remember exactly how confident she looked in this moment, so I could compare it to the look she would have when her entire world collapsed. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. I simply nodded slowly. I told her I understood exactly what kind of father I needed to be. She looked pleased. She thought she had won. She thought my nod was a sign of submission. She turned around and walked back up the stone steps, her expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. She went back inside the massive house and closed the heavy oak door. The lock clicked shut, echoing in the quiet morning air. I stood alone in the driveway. The sun was shining brightly, but the air was bitterly cold. I walked over to my sensible domestic car and got into the driver's seat. I placed my hands on the steering wheel, taking a slow, deep breath. The family man died on that driveway. He was buried under $300,000 of fraudulent debt and the crushing weight of betrayal. The man who started the engine and drove away from the gated community was someone else entirely. I pulled out onto the main road, my mind already sorting through banking regulations, federal fraud statutes, and the legal mechanisms of discovery. They wanted to use me as a shield. They were about to learn that some shields are made of razor wire. I walked down the long curved driveway of their estate. The silence behind me was absolute. I did not look back. I knew that if I turned my head even a fraction, I might see the ghost of the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders, and that weakness would have destroyed me. So I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the gray pavement. Every step I took away from that massive custom-built house felt like a heavy iron chain snapping, releasing me from a lifetime of blind obligation. I reached my modest sedan parked on the street. I opened the door and sat heavily in the driver's seat. I gripped the steering wheel, expecting my hands to tremble. A father who has just been betrayed by his only child should be shaking with grief. But my hands were perfectly steady. That realization surprised me. The father in me was gone. I was simply a man who had just been robbed of his entire future. I started the engine and drove away from the property. As I approached the exit of the gated community, the security guard in the front booth waved at me with a polite smile. I nodded back, performing a hollow mechanical gesture. The plush green lawns and the pristine mansions slowly faded in my rearview mirror. As I merged onto the busy highway, the initial shock of the morning finally receded entirely. It left behind a terrifying and absolute clarity. My daughter and her husband thought my silent departure was a sign of surrender. They thought I walked away without screaming because I was a tired old man who had accepted his inevitable defeat. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my silence. I was not retreating to hide. I was withdrawing to prepare a battlefield they could never survive. My mind immediately shifted to tactical survival. The auditor inside me took full control of the situation. If a commercial lender was coming after my assets to satisfy a $300,000 default, they would not just stop at seizing my house. They would actively target my liquidity. I had $80,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account at my local bank branch. It was money I had accumulated over 3 decades of careful, disciplined living. I needed to move every single penny of it into a secure cashier check or a protected trust before the aggressive lawyers at the commercial bank found it. I bypassed the highway exit for my quiet neighborhood and took the faster route straight into the downtown financial district. I pulled into the parking lot of my local bank. The afternoon sun was casting long, dark shadows across the concrete pavement. I walked through the heavy glass double doors, feeling a massive sense of urgency perfectly masked beneath a calm exterior. I approached the nearest open teller station. A young man behind the counter smiled warmly and asked how he could assist me today. I pulled my debit card and my state-issued driver license from my wallet, sliding them across the polished counter. I told him I needed to close both my checking and savings accounts immediately and withdraw the entire balance. He nodded, typing my account number into his computer system. I watched the reflection of his screen, waiting for the transaction to clear. I was ready to secure my last remaining lifeline so I could begin the war. The young man behind the counter wore a brass name tag that read David. He smiled politely as I handed him my driver license and my debit card. I told him I needed to close my checking and savings accounts immediately and withdraw the entire balance in the form of a certified cashier check. I kept my voice entirely neutral, betraying none of the absolute chaos that had swallowed my morning. I watched his fingers move across his keyboard. I knew exactly how much money was in that institution. I had $82,416. That money represented 35 years of packing my own lunches, skipping vacations, and driving sensible used cars. It was my medical safety net and my peace of mind. I needed it safe and completely liquid before the aggressive commercial lawyers at Apex Lending could locate it. David smiled and clicked his computer mouse. He told me it would just take a moment to process a withdrawal of that size. I stood perfectly still, resting my hands on the cool marble counter of the bank. I breathed evenly, watching the second hand sweep across the large clock on the wall. But the moment stretched into a full minute. Then 2 minutes. I watched the polite smile slowly fade from David's face. A small, confused crease appeared between his eyebrows. He clicked his mouse again, pressing the button much harder this time. He leaned forward, staring closely at his screen. I knew that exact look. During my career as a forensic auditor for the government, I had seen that identical expression on the faces of countless financial clerks when they hit a hard stop in their system. The air in my lungs suddenly felt very thin. David looked up at me with an apologetic and nervous expression. He told me he was getting an error code he had never encountered before. He said my account was flagged with a restrictive administrative hold. He asked me to wait for a moment and quickly walked over to the glass-walled office of the branch manager. I watched them whisper to each other through the glass. The manager was a middle-aged woman with a severe haircut. As David spoke, she looked through the glass directly at me. Her expression was completely devoid of any customer service warmth. It was a cold, calculating look. It was the look of someone observing a major legal liability. She picked up a printed sheet of paper from her desk and walked out of her office. She approached the counter and introduced herself as Sarah. She did not offer her hand for me to shake. Sarah slid the single piece of paper across the marble counter toward me. She kept her voice low so the other customers would not hear. She told me she was terribly sorry, but the bank was legally prohibited from processing my withdrawal. She explained that a court-ordered hold had been placed on my entire financial portfolio just 2 hours ago. I looked down at the paper. It was a notice of a prejudgment attachment filed by Apex Commercial Lending. I felt a cold shock travel down my spine, settling deep in my stomach. The commercial bank had not just filed a standard civil lawsuit. They had filed an emergency injunction to completely freeze my assets, preventing me from hiding or moving my money before the trial even began. They had moved with a speed and a ruthless aggression that took my breath away. They did not wait for a judge to hear my side of the story. Sarah explained that until the lawsuit was entirely resolved, or a judge specifically lifted the order, every single penny I owned was locked down. I could not withdraw cash. I could not write a check for my groceries. I could not even use my debit card to buy a cup of black coffee. I asked her how a bank could freeze my life savings without a court hearing. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear her say it out loud, to confirm the absolute nightmare my daughter had plunged me into. Sarah looked at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort. She explained that commercial lending contracts are built entirely differently than personal consumer loans. When I signed that guarantor agreement for my daughter's backyard permit, which was actually a commercial debt waiver, I had legally waived my right to a preliminary hearing. I had basically handed Apex Lending a master key to my entire financial existence. Trevor and Natalie had not just handed me a massive bill, they had handed me a financial death sentence. They had locked me in a cage and handed the keys to a corporate predator. I reached into my heavy winter coat and pulled out my worn leather wallet. I opened it right there at the teller counter and counted the paper money inside. I had exactly $34. That was it. That was the absolute sum of my usable wealth in the world. Everything else, my $82,000, my checking account, my emergency fund, was trapped behind an impenetrable digital wall. Most people in that situation would have completely lost their minds. Most men my age would have started screaming at the bank manager, demanding access to their own hard-earned money. They would have caused a massive scene or collapsed on the floor in tears. But the forensic auditor inside my head did not panic. He simply recognized a brilliant tactical strike when he saw one. Apex Lending was not a sloppy local credit union. They were a massive predatory institution, and they knew exactly how to corner their prey. They wanted to starve me out. They wanted to make me so desperate and so terrified that I would be forced to sell my house and settle the debt just to survive the winter. I looked at Sarah. I did not raise my voice. I thanked her calmly for her time and for explaining the situation. I picked up my driver license and my completely useless debit card, sliding them back into my wallet. I turned around and walked out of the bank with my head held high. The afternoon sun felt much colder as I stepped back onto the pavement. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. I had $34 to my name. I was fighting a massive commercial bank. I was fighting my own flesh and blood, and I was completely cut off from my own resources. But as I sat there processing the massive disadvantage, I realized they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed the money was my only weapon. They assumed I was just a tired, retired old man with a modest savings account who would easily fold under pressure. They did not know they had just locked a veteran investigator inside an empty room. I started the engine. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. If I was going to fight a corporate shark, I could not do it alone. I needed a shark of my own. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the darkest corner of the city legal district. The law firm of Warren and Associates occupied the top floor of a towering glass building in the center of the financial district. I did not have an appointment. I walked past the mahogany reception desk, ignoring the protests of the young assistant, and headed straight down the hallway toward the corner office. Warren was not the kind of lawyer you hired to draft a polite settlement letter. He was a ruthless commercial litigator. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you needed to completely dismantle an opponent. We had crossed paths over a decade ago during a particularly brutal federal tax audit. He respected my thoroughness, and I knew his hourly rates were astronomical. But I also knew he hated losing far more than he loved money. I opened his heavy oak door without knocking. He was sitting behind a massive desk reviewing a thick stack of depositions. He looked up with a flash of intense annoyance until he recognized my face. I walked in and sat down in the firm leather chair across from him. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the 2 pieces of paper flat on his desk: the civil lawsuit from Apex Commercial Lending and the prejudgment attachment notice from my local bank branch. I did not waste his time with small talk. I did not complain about my daughter or seek his emotional sympathy. I laid out the facts with the clinical detachment of a medical examiner reading an autopsy report. I explained the Tuesday morning deception regarding the fake backyard permits. I explained how Trevor was 24 hours away from total asset seizure before the liability was fraudulently transferred to my shoulders. I watched Warren read through the documents. He did not interrupt me once. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon with terrifying speed. When he finished, he took off his reading glasses and rubbed his temples. The silence in the expansive room was incredibly heavy. Warren leaned back in his leather chair and delivered the blunt truth. He told me that, from a strictly legal standpoint, my situation was an absolute nightmare. He pointed his pen at the final page of the loan agreement. He said the primary problem was not just the signature itself. The problem was that the signature was undeniably authentic. He explained the grim reality of fighting a claim of fraudulent inducement in a commercial court setting. Without written evidence of the deception or a recorded audio confession, proving fraud is almost impossible. It becomes a simple game of he said, she said. And in a commercial court, a judge will look at a 68-year-old man with perfect mental faculties and ask one devastating question. Why did you not read the header of the document before signing it? The court would automatically assume I was a willing participant who simply experienced severe buyer remorse after my son-in-law defaulted on the payments. Warren then picked up the prejudgment attachment notice from my bank. He tapped the paper firmly with his finger. He said Apex Lending had executed a flawless tactical strike against me. By freezing my checking and high-yield savings accounts, they had effectively cut off my oxygen supply before the battle even began. He explained their corporate strategy in brutal detail. They knew that a protracted legal battle to prove fraud could take 2 or 3 years. During that time, my accounts would remain completely locked. I would not be able to pay my annual property taxes. I would not be able to pay my utility bills or even buy my weekly groceries. They were banking heavily on the fact that the sheer terror of sudden poverty would force me to fold within a single month. They expected me to beg for a rapid settlement where I would willingly sell my house to pay off Trevor debt just to get my grocery money back. I asked Warren exactly what it would take to fight the signature in court. I needed to know the precise financial parameters of the battlefield. Warren did not sugarcoat the numbers. He told me that entering a defensive commercial litigation against a bank of this massive size would require a minimum retainer of $50,000 just to survive the initial discovery phase. He said the bank would intentionally bury us in endless legal motions and procedural delays specifically designed to drain my resources. He looked at me with a grim expression. He knew I had the money to fight, but he also knew that money was currently locked inside a digital vault controlled by the very people suing me. I had exactly $34 in my wallet. I could not even afford to validate my parking ticket downstairs, let alone fund a multi-year federal lawsuit. The reality of my situation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. The traditional legal avenue was entirely blocked. My daughter had not just thrown me under the bus. She had chained me to the asphalt. If I tried to fight the signature, I would starve before the case ever saw the inside of a courtroom. If I surrendered, I would lose the home I built and the financial security I had worked my entire adult life to achieve. Warren watched my face closely. He was waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. He was waiting for the moment the retired old man realized he was utterly defeated. Most of his corporate clients broke down at this exact point. They cried or they raged against the inherent unfairness of the justice system, but the panic never surfaced. The fatherly grief was completely suppressed. I looked at the thick loan document sitting on the mahogany desk. I stared at the name of Trevor Logistics Company printed clearly at the top of the page. I thought about the $300,000. I told Warren that the bank had built a perfect legal trap based entirely on a single piece of paper. But I also told him that a piece of paper is just a physical representation of an underlying financial event. A commercial bank does not just hand over $300,000 in briefcases of cash. They wire it. They track it through federal clearinghouses. They require extensive proof of purchase for heavy machinery. They require serial numbers, vendor invoices, and delivery receipts. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I told Warren that we were looking at the problem from the wrong angle. We were trying to bash our heads against a heavily fortified legal wall. I said we needed to stop looking at my signature and start looking at the bank money. Warren frowned slightly. He asked what I meant by that. He reminded me that the money was already gone. Trevor had supposedly lost it all in a severe economic downturn, causing the massive default. But I shook my head slowly. I told Warren that $300,000 does not just evaporate into thin air. It leaves a massive trail. It leaves permanent digital footprints. It moves from one secure account to another. I told him that Trevor was a moderately successful logistics manager, not a seasoned criminal mastermind. If he was desperate enough to trick his own father-in-law to avoid bankruptcy, he was definitely sloppy enough to leave a massive trail of financial evidence behind him. I asked Warren a simple procedural question. I asked him if my legal status as the guarantor gave me the right to demand the primary borrower original loan file. Warren slowly sat up straight in his chair. A small, sharp spark of realization appeared in his eyes. He nodded. He said that as the individual now legally responsible for the massive debt, I had an absolute right to review every single document related to the loan. That included Trevor's initial financial disclosures, the equipment purchase agreements, and the payout routing numbers. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a cold, calculated expression. I told Warren to draft the discovery request immediately. I told him I did not need him to fight the bank in court anymore. I just needed him to legally pry open the door to Trevor's financial records. Once that door was open, I would tear his entire life apart myself. Warren looked at me across his massive mahogany desk. He was a man who dealt with corporate titans and billionaire hedge fund managers. To him, I was just another desperate senior citizen caught in a tragic family dispute. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and steepled his fingers. He asked me how exactly I planned to tear my son-in-law apart. He pointed out that Trevor owned a logistics company with multiple limited liability corporations, shell accounts, and a dedicated accounting team. Warren said finding hidden money in a complex corporate structure requires a specialized team of forensic accountants. He warned me that hiring an external firm to conduct a shadow audit would cost another $20,000 I simply did not have. I let him finish his warning. I understood his skepticism. He only knew me as Gordon, the retired grandfather, who drove a beige sedan and wore sensible shoes. He did not know the man underneath. I told Warren that the beige sedan and the quiet retirement were exactly what they were supposed to be. They were camouflage. For 34 years, my daughter believed I worked a boring administrative job for the federal government. I let her believe that because the reality of my profession was not something you discuss over a Sunday family dinner. I looked Warren dead in the eye and told him I did not need to hire a forensic accountant because I spent 3 decades writing the manual on how to catch them. I told him I was a senior field investigator for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The silence in the expansive corner office was immediate and profound. Warren slowly lowered his hands. The look of professional pity vanished from his face, entirely replaced by a sudden intense curiosity. I explained exactly what my job had entailed for all those years. I did not audit middle-class families who accidentally claimed the wrong standard deduction. I hunted high-level corporate predators. I tracked cartel money laundered through massive commercial real estate portfolios. I dismantled offshore shell companies set up by corrupt politicians and aggressive tax evaders. I told Warren that I had spent my entire adult life staring at complex financial schedules, looking for the single, invisible thread that connected a corporate lie to a hidden bank account. I explained that human beings are remarkably predictable when they steal. They always leave a distinct pattern. They get arrogant, they get greedy, and inevitably, they get incredibly sloppy. And Trevor was not a cartel boss or a seasoned Wall Street mastermind. Trevor was an arrogant amateur who thought his community college business classes made him the smartest man in the room. The transition from victim to predator was now entirely complete. I felt my old investigative instincts waking up, stretching their legs after a decade of forced retirement. My mind was already categorizing the potential methods of asset concealment Trevor might have used. I told Warren that Trevor made the fatal mistake of confusing my paternal kindness with intellectual weakness. I paid off his first failing business loan 5 years ago, not because I believed in his company, but because I wanted my daughter to sleep well at night without the stress of bankruptcy. I kept quiet when he bragged about his financial genius at family dinners because I had absolutely nothing to prove to a boy playing dress-up in a designer suit. They looked at my quiet, modest life and assumed I was a passive utility waiting to be exploited. They never realized they had invited a veteran hunter into their living room and forced him to watch them steal his entire livelihood. Warren leaned forward, a genuine and dangerous smile finally breaking across his face. It was the smile of a ruthless litigator who just realized he had been handed a fully loaded weapon. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him and picked up his silver pen. He asked me exactly what I needed to begin the hunt. I told him I needed the raw data. I needed the original commercial loan application, the heavy equipment purchase invoices, the vendor routing numbers, and the internal bank transfer receipts. I explained that since Apex Commercial Lending had legally forced the primary debt onto my shoulders, they had inadvertently given me full legal clearance to review the entire financial history of the loan. They thought they were chaining me to a sinking ship so Trevor could escape on a lifeboat. They did not realize they had just handed me the complete navigation charts. I told Warren to draft the legal demand for discovery immediately and force the bank to hand over the files. I was going to find out exactly where that $300,000 was hiding, and then I was going to wrap it around Trevor's neck like a legal noose. Warren did not waste a single second. While I sat in his office, he had his legal team draft an emergency demand for discovery. It was a vicious piece of legal machinery, specifically citing my status as the newly appointed primary guarantor. Under federal banking regulations, a guarantor has the absolute right to review the complete risk profile of the debt they are assuming. Warren had his courier hand deliver the demand to the regional headquarters of Apex Commercial Lending before 3 o'clock that same afternoon. The document gave the bank exactly 48 hours to produce the entire unredacted file for Trevor Logistics Company or face an immediate federal injunction for bad faith lending practices. The trap was set, and now all I had to do was wait for the prey to walk into it. The next 2 days were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I was completely cut off from my own money. I ate canned soup from my pantry and drank tap water. I did not call Natalie. I did not answer the 3 text messages she sent me reminding me to sell my house quickly. I existed in a state of absolute focused silence. On the morning of the 3rd day, my burner phone rang. It was Warren. He told me to come to his office immediately. The bank had caved. Faced with the threat of a federal injunction, they had released the digital files. I walked into the law firm and went straight to a small windowless conference room in the back. The table was covered in thick stacks of printed financial schedules. Warren was standing at the head of the table holding a cup of black coffee, looking like a general reviewing a map of enemy territory. He pointed to a massive stack of papers in the center. He told me that was Trevor's entire corporate life for the last 3 years. Every loan application, every vendor invoice, and every bank transfer. I sat down at the table and pulled the first stack toward me. The paper smelled like fresh toner. I did not look at the executive summaries or the glossy business plans. I knew those were just corporate fiction designed to impress lazy loan officers. I went straight for the raw numbers. I opened the general ledger and began to trace the flow of the $300,000. The auditor inside me took over completely. I fell into a state of deep, familiar concentration. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers looking for the anomalies. I was looking for the tiny inconsistencies that criminals always leave behind when they try to build a fake reality. It took me exactly 4 hours to find the first fracture. I was reviewing the disbursement schedule for the heavy machinery Trevor supposedly purchased with the loan. According to the documents, the bank had wired $280,000 directly to a vendor called Industrial Solutions Incorporated. The remaining $20,000 was listed as a consulting fee paid to a third-party logistics broker. I pulled the invoice from Industrial Solutions. It looked professional. It had a sleek logo and a listed address in a corporate park across town. The invoice detailed the purchase of 3 heavy-duty forklifts and a specialized conveyor belt system. But as I looked closer, the illusion began to completely unravel. I checked the employer identification number listed at the top of the invoice. It was a valid federal tax number, but its structure was wrong for a heavy machinery manufacturer. It was formatted like a pass-through entity. I then looked at the serial numbers listed for the 3 forklifts. They were perfectly sequential. ending in 0102 and 03. That never happens in real industrial purchasing. When you buy massive equipment from a massive warehouse, you get whatever units are closest to the loading dock. You do not get perfectly sequential factory numbers unless you are buying them directly off the assembly line. The invoice was not a record of a transaction. It was a digital fabrication created by someone who did not understand the granular details of heavy industry. I called Warren into the room. I laid the invoice flat on the table and pointed to the sequential serial numbers. I explained the discrepancy. Warren looked at the paper, his eyes narrowing. He asked me what it meant. I told him it meant Industrial Solutions Incorporated did not actually exist as a legitimate vendor. It was a shell company. I told him Trevor did not buy any heavy machinery. He created a fake invoice to convince the bank to release the funds. Warren leaned over the table, tracing the routing number on the wire transfer receipt. He told me that if the vendor was fake, the routing number had to go somewhere. The money was wired to a real bank account. I nodded, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. I told him that was the next step. I needed to trace that routing number and find out exactly who was sitting at the end of the wire. I knew in my bones that the money had not vanished into a bad business deal. It had been intentionally stolen and parked somewhere safe, and I was going to find out exactly whose name was on that safe. I pulled the routing number from the document and began to cross-reference it with state corporate registries. The hunt was no longer theoretical. We had found the scent of the blood, and we were going to follow it all the way to the kill. I left the law firm carrying a heavy cardboard box filled with the copied financial schedules. I drove back to my quiet house and carried the box into my dining room. I pushed my small wooden table against the wall, creating a makeshift workstation. I unpacked the documents, organizing them into neat chronological stacks. My focus was entirely singular. I pulled the invoice from the supposed machinery vendor Industrial Solutions Incorporated and set it squarely in the middle of the table. I needed to completely destroy the legitimacy of this document. I needed proof so absolute that the aggressive lawyers at Apex Lending would be forced to drop their lawsuit against me and immediately turn their attention to Trevor. Buying heavy industrial machinery is not like buying a television from a local electronics store. Heavy machinery leaves a massive permanent digital footprint. Manufacturers track every single unit from the moment it leaves the assembly line until it is finally sold for scrap. Every commercial forklift and every industrial conveyor belt has a unique stamped alphanumeric identification sequence. These numbers are required for federal safety registries, commercial insurance policies, and heavy equipment warranties. They are the industrial equivalent of a vehicle identification number. I sat down at the table and opened my personal laptop. During my years at the agency, I had maintained access to several global equipment registries. Even though my official government credentials had been retired a decade ago, the public-facing portals of these massive databases provide more than enough raw data for an investigator who knows exactly how to query the system. I typed in the name of the major international manufacturer listed on Trevor fraudulent invoice. The screen glowed against the dimming light of my dining room. I carefully typed in the 3 sequential serial numbers that supposedly belonged to the brand new heavy-duty forklifts. I pressed the search key and watched the system process the request. The database loaded for a few agonizing seconds. The initial result came back completely blank. The system stated that no such industrial vehicles existed in their current active registry. I did not stop there. I knew a defense attorney could simply claim the numbers were recorded incorrectly by a careless warehouse clerk. I widened my search parameters. I bypassed the specific heavy equipment category and ran a global query on those exact numeric sequences across the entire manufacturing history of the brand. The database finally returned a positive match. The serial numbers were indeed real, but they did not belong to brand new industrial forklifts. According to the historical registry, those specific numbers were assigned to 3 small residential riding lawnmowers manufactured 12 years ago and sold to a regional hardware store in Ohio. Trevor had not even bothered to generate completely random alphanumeric sequences. He had likely walked into a local hardware store or looked in his own garage and copied the numbers off the back of a lawnmower just to fill in the blank spaces on his fake invoice. The sheer laziness of his fraud was staggering. But to completely destroy his defense, I needed physical, undeniable proof that the vendor itself was a ghost. A fake serial number on a piece of paper could be argued away. A fake manufacturing plant could not. I looked at the physical address printed at the top of the Industrial Solutions Incorporated invoice. It listed a suite number in a commercial logistics park on the industrial edge of the city. It sounded incredibly legitimate on paper. I put on my heavy winter coat and got back into my car. The drive took 45 minutes, taking me far away from the manicured lawns of my daughter-gated community and into a bleak gray landscape of concrete warehouses and stacked shipping containers. I navigated through the heavy commercial truck traffic until I reached the specific street listed on the document. I pulled my car over to the shoulder of the road and looked out my passenger window. There was no massive warehouse complex. There was no loading dock filled with heavy machinery waiting to be shipped. The address printed on the $300,000 invoice belonged to a rundown, decaying strip mall sandwiched between a discount tire shop and a fast food restaurant. I turned off the engine, got out of my car, and walked up to the exact suite number printed on the document. It was a small, independent mailing center. It was the kind of place that rents out tiny metal mailboxes to people who need a physical street address instead of a standard post office box. I walked inside the building. The air smelled like cheap cardboard and old packing tape. A teenager wearing a faded uniform shirt was standing behind the counter, looking incredibly bored. I did not ask him any questions. I just stood in the lobby and looked at the massive wall of metal boxes. Someone had paid $30 a month to rent a 6-inch wide metal box, and then used that anonymous box to steal nearly $250,000 from a major commercial lender. I walked back out to my car and sat in the driver's seat, locking the doors. I pulled the loan file from the passenger seat. I knew that commercial banks like Apex Lending usually required photographic evidence or a site inspection before releasing massive funds for heavy machinery. I flipped through the thick stack of papers until I found an appendix labeled Collateral Verification. Inside were 3 glossy color photographs of pristine yellow forklifts sitting in a brightly lit warehouse. I opened my laptop right there in the driver's seat and connected it to my cellular network. I held one of the photographs up to the camera and ran a global reverse image search. It took less than 5 seconds for the search engine to find the exact match. The pictures of the forklifts were not taken in Trevor Logistics' warehouse. They were high-resolution stock photographs stolen directly from the promotional website of a European logistics company. Trevor had downloaded the images, printed them in color, and handed them to the bank as proof of purchase. I closed my laptop and rested my hands on the steering wheel. The phantom machinery was officially verified. There were no forklifts. There was no conveyor belt system. There were absolutely no physical assets for the bank to repossess. The entire business default was a carefully staged event. Trevor had completely fabricated the purchase to convince the bank to release the money. That meant the nearly $300,000 had not vanished into a failed business venture. It had been converted into pure liquid cash. And that cash had been wired to a bank account controlled by the people who rented that tiny metal box. The physical trail was entirely dead, but the digital trail was just beginning. I started the engine of my car. It was time to follow the wire. The drive back to my house from that decaying strip mall was completely silent. I did not turn on the radio. My mind was already mapping out the digital architecture of the federal banking system. When I walked through my front door, the house felt different. It was no longer the quiet sanctuary of a retired man. It was a command center. I went straight back to my dining room table and sat down in front of my laptop. The physical proof was secured. The heavy machinery was a ghost. Now I had to find the actual money. I pulled the wire transfer confirmation from the stack of financial schedules Warren had forced the bank to surrender. The document showed a direct deposit of $280,000 from Apex Commercial Lending into the primary corporate checking account of Trevor Logistics Company. On paper, this was a standard disbursement. The bank funded the borrower so the borrower could pay the vendor. But I knew the vendor did not exist. Therefore, the money that landed in Trevor's account had nowhere legitimate to go. It was sitting there like a massive, unexploded bomb. In my 30 years as a federal investigator, I learned a fundamental truth about stolen money. Criminals are terrified of it. They know that a massive sum of unearned cash sitting in a primary account is a glowing beacon for tax auditors and bank compliance officers. They always try to move it as quickly as possible. I looked at the monthly statements for Trevor's corporate account. The $300,000 loan was deposited on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the entire balance had been drained. Trevor had not simply withdrawn the cash. You cannot walk into a bank branch and ask for $300,000 in paper bills without triggering a massive federal investigation. He had to wire it out. He had to create a digital bridge between his failing logistics company and his secret safe haven. I scanned the ledger looking for the exit point. There it was. A single outgoing wire transfer for $295,000. He had left exactly $5,000 in the account to cover basic overdraft fees and create the illusion of normal operational expenses. I traced my finger across the page following the outgoing wire to its destination routing number. A routing number is like a digital fingerprint for a financial institution. The first 4 digits tell you exactly which Federal Reserve District processed the transaction. I typed the 9-digit sequence into my laptop using a public directory of financial routing transit numbers. I expected to see the name of a local credit union, or perhaps a regional commercial bank. But the system returned something entirely different. The routing number belonged to a massive private wealth management firm headquartered in Delaware. This was a massive escalation. Trevor was not just hiding cash under a mattress. He was utilizing sophisticated institutional banking structures designed specifically to obscure asset ownership. Delaware is notorious in the financial world. It is a corporate haven that allows individuals to register companies and open bank accounts without ever publicly disclosing their true identity. It is a black box. Once money goes in, it becomes incredibly difficult to track who is actually pulling the strings. Most civilian lawyers would hit this Delaware wall and give up. They would tell their clients that the money was gone and the legal fees required to subpoena a private wealth management firm would bankrupt them. But I was not a civilian lawyer. I knew that the black box had a back door. Whenever a wire transfer crosses state lines, it must pass through the automated clearinghouse network. This network acts as a central nervous system for all American banking. And because Warren had filed a comprehensive discovery demand as the legal guarantor, we had not just received Trevor bank statements. We had received the internal clearinghouse tracking receipts. I dug through the massive cardboard box on my floor, pulling out a thin stack of heavily coded dot matrix printouts. These were the back-end documents that bank tellers never see. They contained the raw metadata of the transaction. I spread the printouts across the wooden table. The pages were filled with endless strings of alphanumeric codes. To an untrained eye, it looked like absolute gibberish, but to me it was a perfectly clear map. I started to decode the transaction string line by line. I found the originating institution. I found the Federal Reserve timestamp. And then I found the exact piece of data I needed, the beneficiary account information. When money is wired into a Delaware holding account, the receiving bank must log the specific internal sub-account where the funds are finally deposited. They do not use names, they use account numbers. But an account number is all I needed. I wrote the 15-digit beneficiary account number down on a yellow legal pad. I stared at those 15 digits for a long time. I realized the sheer magnitude of what my daughter and her husband had done. This was not a panic move. When Trevor Logistics Company started failing, he did not just make a desperate mistake. Setting up a Delaware holding account and coordinating a massive wire transfer takes weeks of careful planning. It requires filling out extensive corporate registration forms, paying high retainer fees to specialized lawyers, and establishing a chain of command for the money. They had planned this heist meticulously. They knew their business was going to collapse, and instead of accepting defeat, they decided to extract every last cent of credit they could get their hands on. They planned to steal the money, park it in an untraceable offshore-style account, and let the logistics company die a natural death. But there was one massive flaw in their brilliant plan. The commercial bank would want their money back. When the logistics company defaulted, the bank would aggressively seize all of Trevor's personal assets to recover the $300,000. He would lose the mansion, the luxury cars, and the country club memberships. Their secret Delaware account would be useless if their public life was destroyed. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone with perfect credit, a paid-off house, and a trusting nature to absorb the massive financial blow. They needed a human shield. They looked around their lives and they chose me. They chose the man who had bought Natalie her first bicycle. They chose the man who had paid for her wedding. The cold anger that had settled in my chest hardened into something absolute and unbreakable. I was no longer just fighting to save my house. I was fighting to completely eradicate a pair of ruthless predators. I looked back at the laptop screen. I had the routing number, and I had the internal beneficiary account number. I had followed the wire all the way to the door of the vault. Now all I had to do was find out exactly whose name was on the lease of that Delaware shell company. I reached for my keyboard knowing that the final piece of the puzzle was only a few keystrokes away. I was about to cross the final boundary and uncover the ultimate betrayal. The money was sitting right there waiting in the dark, and I was bringing the light. Have you ever discovered a secret that completely shattered your view of someone you loved? Let me know in the comments below, because the truth I was about to uncover was worse than anything I had imagined. I adjusted my glasses and began to type, ready to breach the walls of their fraudulent empire. I sat in the dim light of my dining room staring at the 15-digit account number written on my yellow legal pad. Finding the account was only half the battle. I needed to connect that string of numbers to a human being. Delaware is famous for being a corporate fortress. It is designed specifically to allow wealthy individuals to hide their assets behind walls of legal anonymity. When you register a limited liability company in Delaware, you do not have to list the names of the owners on the public formation documents. You only have to list the name of a registered agent, which is usually just a generic law firm that charges a few $100s a year to forward mail. To a regular civilian, the trail goes completely cold right there. But I was not a civilian. During my decades hunting federal tax evaders, I learned that there is no such thing as absolute financial anonymity in the United States. The Patriot Act requires banks to know exactly who they are doing business with. You can hide behind a registered agent to the general public, but when you open a commercial bank account to receive a wire transfer of nearly $300,000, a real human being has to sign the banking charter. They have to provide a social security number, and they have to be listed as the managing director of the corporate entity. I opened a secure browser on my laptop and accessed a comprehensive public records database. It was a paid service I still subscribed to from my consulting days. I could not search by the bank account number directly, so I had to work backward from the timeline. I searched the Delaware Division of Corporations for any new limited liability companies, formed exactly 3 weeks before Trevor defaulted on his commercial loan. Criminals rarely set up their shell companies years in advance. They set them up right before they need to catch the stolen money. The search returned over 500 new companies. I needed to narrow the field. I cross-referenced the results with the generic registered agent that Trevor used for his logistics company. Criminals are creatures of habit. They rarely go out and find a brand new lawyer when they are trying to commit fraud quickly. They use the people they already know. The database filtered the results down from 500 to exactly one entity. It was a company called Horizon Capital Holdings. It had been legally registered exactly 22 days before Trevor walked into the bank to submit my forged signature. The timeline was absolutely damning. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the business default was not a sudden tragedy. 22 days before they claimed financial ruin, they were already building the offshore vault to hide the money. They knew exactly what they were going to do. But I still needed the name. I needed the final link in the chain. I bypassed the standard public registry and pulled the initial franchise tax report for Horizon Capital Holdings. In Delaware, if an entity has zero operational revenue in its first month, it must file a basic tax exemption form, and that form must be signed by the managing director under penalty of perjury. The document loaded on my screen. I scrolled past the generic legal boilerplates and the address of the registered agent. I went straight to the bottom of the final page. There was a digital signature on the authorization line. It was not Trevor. The name typed clearly in bold black letters was Natalie. She was listed as the sole managing director and the primary authorized signatory for Horizon Capital Holdings. I sat back in my chair and took a slow, deep breath. The silence in the house was absolute. Until this exact moment, I had allowed myself a tiny sliver of paternal denial. I had allowed myself to believe that Trevor was the mastermind. I had convinced myself that my daughter was just a passive participant who went along with her husband's reckless plan because she was afraid of losing her luxurious lifestyle. I thought she was weak and selfish. But the document on my screen told a completely different story. Trevor was not the mastermind. Trevor was just the incompetent face of the failing logistics company. Natalie was the architect. She was the one who researched Delaware corporate loopholes. She was the one who registered the shell company. She was the one who managed the private wealth account where the stolen money currently sat. And most importantly, she was the one who knew exactly how to manipulate her father. Trevor could never have convinced me to sign that clipboard. He did not have the emotional leverage. Natalie orchestrated the entire fake city permit story because she knew exactly which buttons to push to make me comply. She had weaponized my love for her. She had looked me in the eye, cried real tears, and begged for my help, all while holding the key to the offshore vault she had built 3 weeks prior. It was cold, calculated, and entirely premeditated. She had decided to sacrifice me to secure a $300,000 payday for herself. The revelation was so profound, it completely rewired my understanding of my own life. The woman who came out onto the stone driveway and lectured me about the old making way for the young was not just a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. She was a financial criminal defending her heist. She actually believed she was smarter than the bank and smarter than her own father. She thought her Delaware fortress was impenetrable. I reached out and clicked the print button on my laptop. The printer hummed to life, sliding the crisp white page into the tray. I picked it up and added it to the growing stack of evidence on my table. I now had the fake invoice proving the machinery did not exist. I had the clearinghouse receipt proving the money was wired out. And I had the franchise tax document proving my own daughter was sitting on the stolen cash. The legal noose was completely braided. It was thick, heavy, and ready to be deployed. I just needed to figure out exactly how to drop it around their necks so they could never escape. Just as I placed the document onto the table, the screen of my burner phone lit up. It was a text message from an unknown number. I did not need to guess who it was. The architects of my destruction were getting impatient. They wanted to make sure the old man was breaking according to their schedule. I stared at the glowing phone, ready to engage in the final act of their play. The burner phone vibrated against the wooden table. The screen illuminated the dark dining room, showing a number I knew by heart. It was Natalie. I let it ring 3 times. I needed to center my breathing and lock the forensic auditor firmly in place before I engaged. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the silence on the line. Then she spoke. Her voice was incredibly soft. It was the exact tone she used when she was 7 years old and wanted me to fix a broken toy. She asked me how I was holding up. She actually sounded sympathetic. If I had not just spent the last 6 hours tracing her digital fingerprints to an offshore shell account, I might have believed she actually cared. I told her I was sitting in the dark because my bank accounts were frozen. I kept my voice flat and tired. I needed her to believe the financial starvation tactic was working perfectly. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She said she felt absolutely terrible about the way the bank was treating me. She called the bank predatory and ruthless. She completely removed herself from the equation, acting as if the lawsuit was a random natural disaster that had struck our family. She said Trevor was working around the clock, trying to find a solution, but his hands were tied. I listened to her spin the lie with flawless execution. She was sitting on $300,000 of stolen cash, and she was complaining to me about the stress of the situation. Then she initiated the emotional manipulation. She lowered her voice, making it sound intimate and fragile. She told me that she and Trevor had been talking a lot about the future lately. She said they were planning to start a family next year. She painted a beautiful picture of Sunday dinners and holidays filled with children. She told me how much she wanted her kids to grow up knowing their grandfather. She said she wanted them to play in the yard and listen to my stories. She dangled the promise of future grandchildren in front of me like a piece of meat in front of a starving dog. It was a beautiful vision designed specifically to exploit my deepest paternal desires. But the beautiful vision came with a heavy price tag. Her tone shifted slightly, becoming more practical and firm. She told me that all of those future memories were at risk. She said this silly money issue was creating a toxic environment. She warned me that if I decided to fight Trevor in court, it would destroy the family completely. She said she could never allow her future children to be around a grandfather who sued their father. She was holding children that did not even exist yet as hostages. She was telling me that my access to her future family was entirely conditional on my willingness to let her rob me blind. It was the most calculated and vicious emotional extortion I had ever witnessed. She moved swiftly to her solution. She told me the real estate market was incredibly strong right now. She said my house was worth at least $400,000. If I put it on the market this week, I could have a cash buyer within a month. I could pay off the bank, clear Trevor name, and still have a little bit of money left over. She reminded me about the guest suite above their garage. She said I could move in there rent-free and help raise the babies. She pitched the destruction of my independence as a beautiful family reunion. She wanted me to sell the house I built with my own hands, hand the money over to a commercial bank, and spend the rest of my life living as a dependent in her shadow. I sat at the dining room table looking down at the Delaware franchise tax report. Her name was printed right there as the managing director of Horizon Capital Holdings. I traced the letters of her name with my finger as she continued to talk about family loyalty and sacrifice. The contrast between the words coming out of her mouth and the physical evidence sitting in front of me was staggering. During my years at the agency, I had interrogated cartel bankers and corporate embezzlers, but none of them possessed the sheer sociopathic confidence of my own daughter. She was a master manipulator. She knew exactly how to twist reality to make herself the victim and make my total submission seem like the only moral choice. She assumed I was too old and too tired to see through the illusion. I let her finish her pitch. The silence stretched between us for a long moment. I knew exactly what I needed to do. If I challenged her now, if I confronted her with the Delaware Shell Company over the phone, she would panic. She would wire the money to a different account or try to flee the jurisdiction. I needed to keep her completely comfortable. I needed her to believe she had won the psychological war. I needed her to walk willingly into the final trap. I made my voice sound incredibly weak. I let a slight tremor enter my words. I told her that I was so very tired. I told her the thought of fighting a massive bank in federal court was terrifying to me. I took a shaky breath and said the words she was desperately waiting to hear. I told her she was right. I said the house was just wood and brick, but family was forever. I told her I could not bear the thought of losing her or missing out on my grandchildren. I agreed to sell the house. I agreed to pay the debt. I heard the sharp intake of breath on her end of the line. It was the sound of absolute victory. She had successfully broken her father. Her voice became bright and enthusiastic immediately. She praised me, telling me I was making the right choice for everyone. She said she knew I would come to my senses. She promised everything was going to be wonderful from now on. I listened to her celebrate the complete theft of my life. I did not interrupt her joy. I just stared at the 15-digit account number written on my legal pad, knowing that her victory was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion and that the real execution was about to begin. I hung up the burner phone and placed it gently next to the stack of printed evidence. The silence in the dining room returned, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt like the quiet moments right before a massive storm breaks. Natalie thought she had completely broken me. She thought her emotional extortion had successfully forced me to surrender my home and my independence. She did not realize she had just given me the exact leverage I needed to gather all the guilty parties into one room. I picked up my phone and dialed Warren. He answered on the second ring. I told him Natalie had taken the bait perfectly. I explained her demand that I sell my house to cover the fraudulent commercial loan. Warren let out a low whistle of disbelief at her sheer audacity. I told him it was time to spring the final trap. I instructed him to contact the lead counsel for Apex Commercial Lending immediately. He was to tell them that his client was completely overwhelmed by the legal pressure and the frozen bank accounts and was ready to officially surrender. He was to schedule a formal settlement meeting in their corporate boardroom for Friday morning. He was to tell the aggressive bank lawyers that I was bringing a signed agreement to liquidate my real estate assets and satisfy the $300,000 debt in full. Warren agreed to set the meeting. He knew the bank executives would jump at the chance to close a massive default file so quickly without a protracted legal battle. But I knew the bank lawyers were only half the equation. I needed Trevor and Natalie in that boardroom. I could not just expose the fraud to the bank privately. I needed the architects of the fraud to be trapped inside the blast radius when the truth finally detonated. I drafted a careful text message to Natalie. I kept my words simple and defeated. I told her my lawyer had arranged a final settlement meeting with the bank for Friday at 10 in the morning. I told her I was going to sign over my equity to clear the debt just like she asked. Then I added the crucial bait. I told her that she and Trevor needed to be there in person to sign the final release documents, so Trevor could have his name completely cleared from the corporate default. I knew their greed and their massive egos would never let them miss their own victory parade. They would want to watch the old man formally surrender his life to them. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone chimed. It was a reply from Natalie. She said they would absolutely be there. She added a small heart emoji at the end of the text message. That tiny digital heart was the most grotesque thing I had ever seen. It was a symbol of love pasted casually over an act of total financial violence. I deleted the message and turned my phone off. The next 48 hours were spent in meticulous preparation. I did not focus on the emotional weight of what was about to happen. I focused entirely on the physical evidence. I took the fake invoice from Industrial Solutions Incorporated, the clearinghouse wire transfer receipts, and the Delaware franchise tax report proving Natalie controlled the offshore shell company. I placed them all into a plain manila folder. I did not use a heavy leather briefcase. I wanted to look exactly like the broken, exhausted senior citizen they expected to see. I wanted them to feel absolutely secure right up until the second the floor collapsed beneath them. On Friday morning, I woke up before the sun. I went to my closet and selected my clothes with careful intention. I chose a slightly worn gray suit I had owned for 15 years. It was clean and pressed, but it looked tired. It was the uniform of a defeated man. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and looked at my reflection. The face looking back at me was lined with age and gray hair, but the eyes were completely different. The eyes were sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. The father who had loved his daughter unconditionally was gone. The man wearing the gray suit was a retired federal investigator, carrying a folder full of federal felonies. I walked through my quiet house one last time. I touched the wooden doorframes I had sanded and painted. I looked at the kitchen where I had cooked thousands of family meals. They wanted to take this from me. They wanted to strip away my dignity and leave me with absolutely nothing. I picked up the plain manila folder from the dining room table. It felt incredibly light in my hands considering it contained the absolute destruction of 2 human lives. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me. The morning air was crisp and completely clear. I got into my car and started the engine. I placed the folder on the passenger seat and drove toward the financial district ready to execute the final adjustment. The Apex Commercial Lending Building was a massive monolithic structure of steel and reflective glass dominating the downtown financial skyline. It was architectural intimidation designed specifically to make the average citizen feel incredibly small and entirely powerless. I parked my modest domestic sedan in the dimly lit underground parking garage and took the express elevator up to the 42nd floor. My attorney Warren was already waiting for me in the expansive marble lobby. He wore a dark charcoal suit that looked like expensive tailored armor. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask how I was feeling. He simply looked at the plain manila folder clutched in my hand and gave a single sharp nod of confirmation. The preparation was over. We walked past the receptionist and proceeded down a long, silent corridor lined with frosted glass walls. The corporate environment was completely sterile, smelling faintly of ozone and industrial cleaning supplies. Warren pushed open the heavy oak double doors leading into the executive boardroom. The room was massive, anchored by a long, polished mahogany table that stretched almost 20 feet across the floor. The far wall was made entirely of floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the city below. It was a room designed to make the people sitting inside it feel like gods ruling over the concrete jungle. 2 men in sharp gray suits were sitting on the opposite side of the table. These were the senior litigators representing the commercial bank. They did not bother to stand up or offer their hands when I walked into the room. They looked at me with a potent mixture of corporate boredom and predatory satisfaction. To these men, I was not a human being who had been betrayed by his family. I was simply a delinquent financial file that was finally being closed. They had thick stacks of legal documents arranged perfectly in front of them. The papers were marked with bright blue sticky tabs indicating exactly where I was supposed to sign away my home and my future. My attention shifted away from the hostile bank executives and focused on the far end of the long table. My daughter and her husband were already seated waiting for the show to begin. Natalie and Trevor had dressed up specifically for this occasion. Trevor was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly, and a heavy gold watch that caught the sunlight pouring through the windows. He looked nothing like a man whose logistics company had just collapsed into massive default. Natalie wore a pristine white designer dress and delicate diamond earrings. They looked absolutely radiant. They looked like young, successful executives celebrating a massive corporate acquisition. They had completely insulated themselves from the reality that their luxurious lifestyle was built entirely on my imminent destruction. When Natalie saw me walk into the room, she offered me a soft, incredibly patronizing smile. It was the exact kind of smile you give to a tired old dog right before you put it to sleep. She tilted her head, giving a flawless performance of a deeply concerned daughter who was just relieved her stubborn father had finally seen reason. Trevor did not even bother to pretend he cared. He leaned far back in his heavy leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, radiating absolute arrogance. He looked at me as if I were a slow-moving servant who had finally arrived to clean up his mess. Warren pulled out a leather chair for me, and I sat down directly across from the bank lawyers. I placed the plain manila folder flat on the polished mahogany table directly in front of me. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not look angry. I did not look terrified. I perfectly maintained the fragile illusion of a broken senior citizen who had finally run out of options. The lead bank attorney cleared his throat, breaking the heavy, expectant silence in the room. He tapped his expensive gold pen against the thick stack of settlement papers. He began to speak using that rapid, condescending legal tone specifically designed to intimidate civilians into quick compliance. He stated for the record that we were gathered to finalize the voluntary liquidation of my real estate assets to fully satisfy the corporate default of the logistics company. I listened to his voice drone on, absorbing the absolute confidence radiating from my daughter sitting across the table. They all thought the game was over. They had absolutely no idea the executioner had just taken his seat. The lead bank attorney stopped talking and pushed a pristine silver pen across the polished mahogany table toward me. He pointed to the thick stack of settlement documents demanding my signature. The silence in the room was absolute, waiting for me to surrender. I looked at the pen, and then I looked directly into Natalie's eyes. She gave me that same patronizing smile, expecting me to fold. But I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and placed both hands flat on the table. The sudden shift in my posture was subtle, but it immediately broke the illusion of the defeated old man. I told the lead attorney that I appreciated his thorough explanation of the settlement terms. Then I looked at Trevor, who was still leaning back in his chair with absolute arrogance. I told the room that I was not there to sign a settlement agreement. I stated clearly and calmly that I was not going to give the bank my house, and I was certainly not going to pay Trevor's fraudulent debt. The immediate reaction was profound confusion. The lead attorney frowned, picking up his silver pen and tapping it against his legal pad. He asked me if I understood the severity of the prejudgment attachment on my bank accounts. He reminded me that if I walked out of this room without signing, my assets would remain frozen, and I would be dragged through years of expensive federal litigation that I could not possibly afford. Natalie's patronizing smile vanished completely, replaced by a sharp look of intense irritation. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. She used my first name again, trying to reassert her dominance. She told me to stop being difficult and just sign the paperwork so we could all move on with our lives. She actually tried to frame my refusal as an act of petty stubbornness rather than a desperate fight for survival. Trevor finally sat up straight, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. He looked at my attorney, Warren, and asked him if he was going to let his client make a massive mistake. Trevor assumed Warren was just a standard family lawyer who would force me to settle to collect his hourly fee. Trevor had absolutely no idea who he was talking to. Warren did not look at Trevor. He looked directly at the senior bank litigators. Warren's voice was deep and resonant, filling the massive boardroom. He told the bank attorneys that his client was completely aware of the legal and financial consequences of refusing the settlement. Warren then stated that his client was refusing the settlement because the underlying commercial debt was entirely built on a foundation of federal wire fraud and systemic asset concealment. The word fraud hung in the air like a physical weight. The two bank attorneys stopped moving completely. In the world of high-level commercial lending, fraud is the absolute worst-case scenario. It means their internal compliance protocols failed, and millions of dollars are potentially unrecoverable. The lead attorney narrowed his eyes, staring at Warren. He demanded an immediate explanation. He said the bank had a perfectly legal guarantor agreement signed by my own hand, and that any claims of fraud were just desperate delay tactics from a man trying to avoid his financial obligations. I did not let Warren answer. This was my fight. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked directly at the lead attorney. I told him that my signature was indeed authentic, but the circumstances surrounding its procurement were entirely deceptive. I told him that was a matter for a civil court to decide, and I was perfectly willing to fight that battle. But then I paused, letting the silence stretch for a long, terrifying second. I told the bank attorney that the civil dispute over my signature was entirely irrelevant compared to what Trevor and Natalie had done with the bank's money. I reached out and placed my hand on the plain manila folder sitting in front of me. I told the room that I spent 35 years working as a senior forensic investigator for the Internal Revenue Service, tracking offshore shell companies and corporate embezzlement. I watched the blood completely drain from Trevor's face. The arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of absolute pure terror. He looked at Natalie, whose eyes were wide with sudden shock. They had spent their entire lives believing I was a boring, low-level government clerk. They had based their entire criminal enterprise on the assumption that I was financially illiterate. The realization that they had accidentally targeted a veteran financial predator hit them like a physical blow. I slid the manila folder slowly across the polished mahogany table toward the lead bank attorney. The folder stopped precisely in front of him. I told him that inside that folder, he would find the absolute destruction of his $300,000 commercial loan. I told him he would find proof that the heavy machinery his bank supposedly financed did not actually exist. I told him he would find proof that the entire default was a carefully staged event. And finally, I told him he would find the exact routing numbers and the Delaware Shell Company franchise tax reports, proving exactly where the stolen money was currently sitting. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I delivered the truth with the cold, clinical precision of an executioner dropping the blade. The illusion of my defeat was entirely shattered, and the real trial had just begun. The lead attorney slowly opened the plain manila folder. His eyes immediately fell upon the first document. It was the invoice from Industrial Solutions Incorporated. I watched his face closely. A good commercial litigator knows exactly what a legitimate equipment invoice looks like, and he knows what a desperate fabrication looks like. I did not wait for him to ask questions. I began my audit. I kept my voice perfectly level, speaking with the measured cadence of an expert witness testifying in federal court. I directed my attention to the two bank lawyers, completely ignoring my daughter and her husband for the moment. I told them to look closely at the serial numbers listed for the 3 heavy-duty forklifts. I explained that heavy machinery manufacturers do not issue perfectly sequential serial numbers ending in 0, 102, and 03 to a single retail buyer unless they are pulling them directly off a custom assembly line. I told the lawyers that I had run those specific alphanumeric sequences through the Global Equipment Registry. I let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow regarding the machinery. I informed the room that those serial numbers actually belonged to 3 residential riding lawnmowers manufactured over a decade ago. The second bank attorney leaned over, staring at the paper. His corporate boredom had completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. I told them to turn to the next page. It was a photograph of the decaying strip mall where the supposed vendor was located. I explained that Industrial Solutions Incorporated was not a massive manufacturing warehouse. It was a $30 a month metal mailbox inside a discount shipping center. I watched Trevor out of the corner of my eye. He had stopped breathing. His hands were gripping the armrests of his leather chair so hard his knuckles were entirely white. I was methodically dismantling his fragile ego right in front of the men he had tried to impress. I told the bank lawyers to look at the collateral verification photographs Trevor had submitted, the glossy pictures of the yellow forklifts. I handed them the printed results of my reverse image search. I explained that their primary borrower had simply downloaded stock photography from a European website and passed it off as verified collateral. I told them there was no machinery. There were no assets to repossess. The entire loan application was a carefully constructed fiction designed to extract $300,000 in pure liquid cash. The lead attorney looked up from the folder. His face was pale. He realized his bank had just authorized a massive uncollateralized payout to a ghost. He asked me directly where the money went. He knew that if the machinery was fake, the funds were stolen. I told him to turn to the third document in the folder. It was the Internal Clearinghouse wire transfer receipt. I explained that criminals are incredibly predictable when they steal large sums of money. They panic and try to move the cash as far away from the crime scene as quickly as possible. I walked the lawyers through the general ledger of Trevor Logistics Company. I pointed out the exact timeline. The loan was deposited on a Tuesday, and by Thursday afternoon, $295,000 had been wired out of the primary account. I read the destination routing number out loud, letting the numbers echo in the massive boardroom. I told them the money did not go to a vendor. It went to a private wealth management firm headquartered in Delaware. Until this moment, Natalie had remained completely silent. She was sitting frozen in her chair, her pristine white designer dress suddenly looking entirely out of place. She still thought she was safe. She thought Trevor was taking the fall for the fake invoices. She thought her offshore shell company was an impenetrable fortress of anonymity. I turned my head and looked directly at my daughter. The maternal, patronizing smile was completely gone. She looked like a trapped animal. I told the room that Delaware is a notorious corporate haven used to hide stolen assets. I explained that while the public registry hides the true owners, the federal banking system does not. I told the lead attorney to turn to the final page in the manila folder. It was the initial franchise tax report for Horizon Capital Holdings. I instructed him to look at the authorized signature at the bottom of the page. I did not read the name myself. I forced the bank lawyer to do it. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses and read the name aloud. Natalie. The sound of her own name being read from a federal fraud document completely shattered Natalie. She let out a sharp gasp, pressing her hand against her mouth. Trevor turned to look at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and terror. Even in his incompetence, he apparently did not know the full extent of her involvement. He thought she was just holding the money, not actively managing the shell corporation. The entire dynamic of their marriage collapsed right there in the boardroom. They were no longer partners in a successful corporate lifestyle. They were co-conspirators in a massive federal felony, and the walls were rapidly closing in. I looked at Natalie and told her that her Delaware account was not a safe haven. I told her it was a digital cage and she had just locked herself inside it. She tried to speak. She stammered, saying that it was a misunderstanding, that she was just managing an investment fund for her husband. Her voice was shaking so badly, the words barely made sense. She was no longer the confident architect of my destruction. She was just a frightened amateur who had been caught red-handed by the exact man she had tried to destroy. I turned my attention back to the bank litigators. They were no longer looking at me as a delinquent debtor. They were looking at Natalie and Trevor as hostile criminal targets. I explained that under federal lending laws, a guarantor agreement is completely null and void if the underlying contract was executed under fraudulent pretenses by the primary borrower. I told them they could spend the next 3 years trying to sue a 68-year-old man for a forged signature on a fake permit, or they could pick up the telephone right now and recover their stolen $300,000 from the Delaware account sitting on the table. I gave them the exact account numbers, the routing codes, and the managing director identification. I had handed them a perfectly wrapped gift. I had done the job of an entire federal investigative team in less than 48 hours. The lead attorney slowly closed the manila folder. He placed his hands flat on top of it. He looked at me with a new expression. It was a look of profound professional respect. He realized he was not sitting across from a victim. He was sitting across from an apex predator who had just delivered the heads of his enemies on a silver platter. The silence in the executive boardroom was deafening. The aggressive posture of the bank lawyers had completely dissolved into cautious awe. They were looking at the perfectly documented trail of a massive corporate theft. Trevor was staring at the floor, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. Natalie was crying now, but they were not the manipulative tears she had used to trick me into signing the clipboard. They were tears of absolute panic. She looked at me, begging silently with her eyes. She wanted the father who had always fixed her mistakes to magically appear and save her from the consequences of her own greed. But that father was dead. He died the moment she looked him in the eye and told him he was a disposable asset. I sat perfectly still, watching the destruction I had orchestrated unfold. I felt no joy and no sorrow. I simply felt the cold satisfaction of a balanced ledger. I had cleared my name, and I had exposed the truth. The burden of the debt was no longer mine to carry. I had handed it right back to the people who created it, and this time it was going to crush them completely. The lead attorney did not ask any more questions. He did not need to. The paper trail I had provided was absolute and indisputable. He looked at the second attorney and gave a single brief nod. The corporate boredom that had filled the room just 30 minutes ago was completely erased. It was replaced by the cold, mechanical efficiency of a financial institution moving to protect its capital. The second attorney immediately stood up from his leather chair and walked over to the heavy oak double doors. He locked them from the inside. The loud click of the deadbolt echoed through the silent boardroom. It was a clear signal. Nobody was leaving this room until the authorities arrived. Trevor jumped slightly at the sound of the locking door. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He looked frantically at the windows and then back at the door like a trapped rat, realizing there was absolutely no way out. Natalie remained frozen in her seat. Her pristine white dress seemed to mock the absolute mess she had made of her life. She was staring at the manila folder on the table, as if it were a poisonous snake that had just bitten her. The lead attorney picked up the sleek black conference phone sitting in the center of the mahogany table. He did not call his internal security team. He did not call the local police department. When $300,000 of commercial banking funds are wired across state lines using a fraudulent shell company, it instantly becomes a massive federal issue. He pressed a sequence of buttons and put the phone on speaker. The dial tone rang out loudly in the massive room. Every single ring felt like a hammer striking a nail into the coffin they had built for themselves. A voice answered on the third ring. It was a crisp, professional voice identifying itself as the intake desk for the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. The lead attorney introduced himself, stating his full name and his position as Senior Litigation Counsel for Apex Commercial Lending. He kept his eyes locked on Trevor the entire time he spoke. He stated clearly that he was sitting in his corporate boardroom with two individuals who had just perpetrated a massive wire fraud and asset concealment scheme against his institution. Trevor let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He actually raised his hands as if he could physically push the words back into the phone. He started babbling incoherently, saying that he could get the money back and that it was all just a terrible misunderstanding. The second attorney stepped closer to him and told him very quietly to shut his mouth. Trevor collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The lead attorney continued his conversation with the federal agent on the speakerphone. He read off the 15-digit Delaware routing number I had provided. He gave them the name of the shell company. He spelled out the full name of my daughter as the managing director of the fraudulent account. He formally requested an immediate emergency freeze on the offshore funds and asked for agents to be dispatched to the bank headquarters to take the primary suspects into federal custody. The agent on the phone confirmed the request. He stated that a rapid response team was only 10 minutes away. The call disconnected, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had completely crushed them. I sat quietly in my chair, watching the federal machinery take over. I had done exactly what I promised myself I would do. I had protected my home. I had secured my future. And I had completely eliminated the parasites who tried to feed on my quiet life. The federal agents arrived at the executive boardroom exactly 12 minutes after the phone call ended. There were 4 of them wearing dark suits and carrying heavy tactical belts. They did not knock. They used a master key provided by the building security and stepped into the room with absolute authority. The lead agent asked Trevor and Natalie to stand up and place their hands on the polished mahogany table. Trevor complied immediately, his entire body shaking violently. He was sobbing loudly, pleading with the agents that he was just a businessman who made a bad decision. Natalie just sat there, staring blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of her reality. until an agent gently but firmly pulled her up by her arm. I did not stay to watch them put the cold steel handcuffs on my daughter. I had no desire to witness the physical reality of her arrest. I simply nodded to Warren, stood up from my leather chair, and walked out of the open double doors. The heavy corporate air felt suddenly light and breathable as I walked down the long, silent corridor. By the time I reached my car in the underground parking garage, the legal machinery was already moving to completely detach me from the disaster. Warren stayed behind to finalize the necessary paperwork with the lead bank attorney. He was incredibly efficient. Within 48 hours, a formal document arrived at my house via certified mail. It was a dismissal with prejudice. Apex Commercial Lending had officially dropped me from the civil lawsuit, recognizing that my signature was procured through documented criminal deception. More importantly, the federal judge overseeing the fraud case immediately lifted the prejudgment attachment on my local bank accounts. My $82,000 was unfrozen. My checking account was fully operational. The financial starvation tactic they had used to try and break me was completely dismantled. I was free to buy my groceries and pay my property taxes without fear. For Trevor, the reality of his failure was absolute and immediate. With his primary corporate accounts seized by the federal government, his logistics company suffered a catastrophic implosion. He could not make payroll on Friday. By Monday morning, his entire warehouse staff walked off the job demanding their unpaid wages. Without workers, the shipping contracts were violently breached, and his remaining corporate clients completely abandoned him. The bank moved in rapidly to liquidate whatever legitimate assets were left in the warehouse just to recoup their initial operational losses. The luxury cars parked in his pristine driveway were repossessed by the end of the week. The massive house in the gated community was placed into foreclosure. The beautiful facade of his success evaporated almost overnight, leaving nothing behind but a mountain of debt and public disgrace. The federal investigation into the Delaware Shell Company was incredibly swift. Because I had handed them the exact routing numbers and the franchise tax reports, the agents did not have to spend months building a circumstantial case. They subpoenaed the private wealth management firm and froze the stolen $295,000 before Natalie could even attempt to transfer it to a foreign jurisdiction. 2 weeks after the boardroom meeting, the Department of Justice handed down formal indictments. Trevor and Natalie were both charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. They were no longer dealing with a civil dispute over a defaulted business loan. They were facing federal prosecutors who possessed an absolutely perfect paper trail. The potential penalty for their crimes was up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. They had tried to steal my modest home to save their mansion, and as a direct result, they were going to lose their freedom entirely. 3 weeks after the boardroom meeting, my life had returned to its quiet rhythm. I was sitting on my back porch drinking a cup of coffee when I heard a frantic pounding on my front door. It was not the confident, sharp ring of a process server. It was the desperate hammering of someone who had completely run out of options. I walked slowly through the house and opened the front door. Natalie was standing on my porch. The pristine white designer dress and the delicate diamond earrings were completely gone. She was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt, and her hair was a tangled mess. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying. She looked exhausted and utterly terrified. She did not try to project any authority or arrogance this time. She immediately started weeping the moment she saw my face. She told me the federal prosecutors were officially moving forward with the grand jury indictment. She said the public defender assigned to her case was completely overwhelmed and had told her she was facing a minimum of 10 years in prison. She grabbed the edge of the wooden doorframe and begged me to hire Warren to defend her. She said I was the only person in the world who could afford a high-level criminal defense attorney now that all of her offshore accounts and local assets were frozen. She looked at me with those wide, panicked eyes and pleaded with me to save her. She told me I was her father and that I had a moral obligation to protect her from this nightmare. I stood in the doorway, looking at the woman I had raised from a child. I vividly remembered the exact words she had spoken to me on the paved driveway of her massive mansion. I remembered how calmly she had explained that my financial destruction was simply a necessary sacrifice for the survival of her luxurious lifestyle. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of parental instinct, but I found absolutely nothing. I did not feel a single drop of pity for her. I told her that the father who used to fix all of her careless mistakes died the morning she handed me a fraudulent lawsuit and told me my quiet life was over. I kept my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any emotion. I told her I was not going to spend a single penny of my hard-earned savings to defend a woman who meticulously planned to steal my home. She collapsed to her knees on the concrete porch, right there in the cold morning air. She sobbed violently, apologizing over and over again. She promised she would change her ways. She promised she would spend the rest of her life making it up to me if I just kept her out of a federal penitentiary. But I knew the apology was completely hollow. She was not sorry she had tried to completely ruin me. She was only sorry she had been caught by the federal government. I looked down at her weeping form one last time. I told her that nature dictates the old must make way for the young. I repeated her own cruel philosophy back to her. I told her it was time for her to face the grim future she had so carefully built for herself. I stepped back into the warmth of my hallway. I did not raise my voice or offer any parting advice. I simply reached out and took hold of the heavy brass handle. She reached her shaking hand out toward me, screaming my name one last time. I pulled the heavy door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud and absolute finality, locking her outside forever. I turned my back on the entryway and walked back toward my kitchen, leaving the muffled sounds of her crying to fade entirely into the quiet morning. The morning air was crisp as I stepped onto my back wooden deck. I sat down in my favorite chair, holding a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. For the first time in over a month, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. The house behind me was completely silent and entirely mine. The deed was secure in a protective trust. My bank accounts were fully restored. The $82,000 I had saved over a lifetime of hard work was sitting safely in my local branch, completely untouched by the greedy hands of commercial bankers and treacherous family members. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my body. The war was officially over, and I had won. People often ask me if I feel lonely now that I have completely cut my only daughter out of my life. They assume a father should feel a massive void where his child used to be. But sitting on that porch, I realized the profound difference between being alone and being free. For 34 years, my life had been a series of endless sacrifices to fund her vanity. I had delayed my own happiness, drained my own resources, and compromised my own peace just to keep her comfortable. Severing that tie did not feel like losing a limb. It felt like surgically removing a massive malignant tumor that had been slowly killing me. The silence in my house was not empty. It was filled with an absolute, unshakable peace. I did not miss her because the person I thought I was missing had never actually existed. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden table next to my chair and picked up a glossy travel brochure I had brought outside with me. It was a detailed itinerary for a month-long guided tour through the Tuscan countryside and the Amalfi Coast. It was a trip I had desperately wanted to take 10 years ago, but I had canceled it to pay for Natalie's extravagant wedding. I traced the pictures of the rolling green hills and the ancient stone vineyards with my finger. I did not have to ask anyone for permission anymore. I did not have to worry about leaving a safety net behind for a financially incompetent son-in-law. I had survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely victorious. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the number for the travel agency. When the agent answered, I told her I was ready to book the premium package and I would be paying in full. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the birds singing in the oak trees in my backyard. I had spent my entire life playing by the rules and protecting the people I loved. When those same people tried to destroy me, I did not break. I simply changed the rules of the game. I am 68 years old, and for the very first time, my life belongs entirely to me. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to save your own sanity? Let me know your story in the comments below. If you found my journey satisfying, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and survival. Thank you for listening to my story. Never let anyone convince you that your kindness is a weakness.